Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to introduce inflation. So this will be the first video of the second government macroeconomic objective. So remember, this is the macroeconomic objective series, and the second mini-series will focus on the second objective, which is low and stable inflation rate. In this video I'm going to distinguish between inflation, disinflation and deflation. I'm going to explain how inflation and deflation are measured and calculated. I'm going to explain how different income earners experience different rates of inflation because their patterns of consumption might not be accurately reflected. I'm going to talk about how inflation figures, I'm going to explain that inflation figures may not accurately reflect changes in consumption patterns or the quality of the products produced. I'll talk about how economists, so I'll explain that economists measure a core underlying rate of inflation, and this is to eliminate sudden swings in prices. And I'm going to explain what a producer price index is and how it can be useful. So there's plenty to cover, so I'll just get started. So the first learning outcome taken from the IB economics syllabus in the macroeconomic objective section is to be able to distinguish between inflation, disinflation, and deflation. Let's get started. Inflation refers to the sustained or persistent rise in the average price level in an economy over time. Now, certain things you need to keep in mind. Inflation refers to a sustained or persistent rise as opposed to a one-off rise. So say, for example, the government passes new indirect taxes and suddenly everything in the economy becomes more expensive. This is considered more of a one-off rise due to the raising the rate of taxation. And also keep in mind, you need to distinguish between when every single good and service its price rises versus, on average, prices in the economy are rising. Inflation is an average, the inflation rate, so it looks more on average. Yes, some goods might be getting more expensive, some goods might be cheaper, but on average, if the average price level in the economy is rising, we call this inflation. Deflation is the opposite of inflation. So it's a persistent or a sustained fall in the average price level in an economy overnight. Over time, not overnight. Deflation happens when the inflation rate is negative. So this is when you have the average price level is falling, so the inflation rate is negative. We will distinguish in a later video between good deflation. There is good deflation, but there's also bad deflation. Some people think all deflation is good, everything's getting cheaper. Not necessarily. There is good deflation and there is bad deflation. The last one we need to be able to define and distinguish between is disinflation. Now, disinflation is a slowing down of inflation. So prices are still rising, but at a slower pace. A lot of students confuse disinflation with deflation. Remember, disinflation means that there is still inflation. The inflation rate is positive, it's just lower than it used to be the year before. Deflation means the prices on average are falling, the average price level is falling and the inflation rate is negative. So make sure you don't confuse disinflation with deflation. So how is inflation or deflation measured? Economists use something called a consumer price index, CPI. It is a weighted index that measures the changes in the prices of a basket of goods and services consumed by the average household. So basically, economists look at the average household. During a year, what do they consume? What do they buy? And they put together something that is called a basket of goods and services. So that's all the goods and services consumed by the average household in a typical year. Each item in the basket, obviously some things in the basket are more important than others. For example, housing, what households spend on housing is probably more important than what they spend on cinema, movie tickets. So each item in the basket is weighted, given a weight according to its relative importance as part of an average household's expenditure. For example, housing and food, which are necessities, will be assigned more weight than cinema tickets and takeaway coffee, for example. Goods and services that take up a larger proportion of income are assigned a larger weighting. So how do they assign the weighting? Depending on the proportion of income spent on that good or service. And this is how inflation is measured. So we mentioned that to calculate or to measure the inflation rate, economists will put together the basket of goods and services consumed by the average household. So here's a numerical example. Assume, for example, in 2015, that basket of goods and services consumed by the typical or average household cost $50,000. Okay? In 2016, that exact same basket, it has to be the same basket so that you can actually make comparisons over time. That exact same basket cost $51,000, and in 2017, that exact same basket cost $53,000. The first thing economists would do is they would decide or they would determine the base year. The base year is essentially the year that you base all your comparisons on. Now, the base year is the year that gets the CPI of 100. So the CPI for the base year is 100. Therefore, in the future, it makes future comparisons much easier. Now, if 2015 is the base year and I want to measure the inflation rate between 2015 and 2016, so basically what I would take is the cost of the basket in 2016, which is 51,000, minus the cost of the basket in the base year, 50,000, divided by the cost of the basket in the base year times 100. Now, that should give me, if I am correct, however, I'm not going to risk it, I'm actually going to do it on a calculator here. So 51,000 minus 50,000 minus 50,000 divided by 50,000 times 100, that gives you 2%. Now that means that the CPI for 2016 is 2% higher than the CPI in the base year, which means the CPI is 102. Okay? Now, if you do the same calculation between 2017 and the base year, 2016, it would be 53,000 minus 50,000. So that's 3,000 divided by 50,000 times 100. That's 6%. So between 2017 and 2015, prices have risen by 6%. So the CPI in 2017 will be 6% higher than the base year, not the year before. The base year is 106. Now, say, for example, what you want to do is calculate the inflation rate between 2016 and 2017. Well, it's very easy now. What you do is you take the CPI of the new year, so CPI of 2017 minus the CPI of 2016 divided by the CPI of the old year, that you're comparing, times 100. So in that case, to measure the inflation rate between 2016 and 2017, it would be essentially, let me just block off the space, it would be 106 minus 102 divided by 102 times 100. If you calculate that, 106 minus 102 divided by 102 divided by 102 times 100, that means it's 3.92%. So the inflation rate between 2016 and 2017 is 3.92%. So remember, to get the CPI, you are comparing to the base year that you set at the beginning of the period of time that you're measuring. To get it between one year and the other, once you've gotten the CPI figures, you just take the new CPI minus the old CPI divided by the old CPI times 100, and that should give you the inflation rate. I hope this example makes it clearer. So let's continue. So certain challenges involved in measuring or calculating the inflation rate. The first one is that different income earners may experience a different rate of inflation. This is because the CPI only takes the basket of goods and services consumed by the average household, okay? Therefore, their pattern of consumption, maybe if you're a super rich or a super poor household, your pattern of consumption might not be accurately reflected in the CPI. The spending pattern of a pensioner, for example, will differ dramatically from the spending pattern of a college student. They will have very different consumption patterns. And this will also differ dramatically from the spending pattern of an average household. So that's one problem or one difficulty in measuring inflation. Different income earners, their pattern of consumption might not be reflected. A high-income household versus a middle income versus a low-income household, they will have very different patterns of consumption. The CPI will only be pitched at the average level of income, so it will be more accurate of a middle-income household pattern of consumption than a high-income or a low-income. Another challenge involved with measuring inflation is that inflation figures may not accurately reflect changes in consumption patterns. Sometimes people's consumption patterns change, and if the CPI, if that basket is not updated with the appropriate goods and services and the appropriate weights, it might not accurately reflect changes in consumption patterns. It also might not reflect the quality of the products purchased. So if certain products are becoming more expensive, but also their quality is increasing, that will be seen as inflation. However, if quality is also increasing, it doesn't sound that bad, does it? So inflation figures don't show quality of the products purchased if the quality is improving, and they don't reflect changes in consumption patterns. The other challenge is that there are usually some commodities like food and maybe oil that experience sudden swings. So these sudden swings affect the inflation rate calculation. So what do economists do? What they do is to eliminate those sudden swings, they measure a core or underlying rate of inflation to eliminate those sudden swings. They try to find a core or underlying rate of inflation by averaging out those price swings over a period of time. That's the core or underlying rate of inflation. So these are some challenges, as I said earlier, involved in measuring and calculating the inflation rate. Another index that economists use and they find very helpful is the producer price index. So economists will also measure something called a producer price index, PPI. This measures changes in the prices of factors of production. So it focuses more on the production side of things as opposed to the consumption side of things. The CPI, Consumer Price Index, focuses on the consumption patterns of an average household. The PPI focuses on the production patterns because producers will employ factors of production. So PPI is very useful in predicting future inflation because if the prices of the factors of production rise, costs of production will rise, and eventually these higher costs of production will be passed on to the consumers in the form of higher prices. So calculating the producer price index helps in predicting future inflation. The basket for measuring a PPI may include prices of, say, raw materials, key raw materials like crude oil and copper, prices of components and semi-finished goods sold to manufacturers, as well as the prices of finished goods that are sold to retailers. So it will also be a basket of the factors of production that are employed by the typical producer. And this helps in predicting future inflation because if the PPI rises, that means the prices of factors of production on average, the prices are rising, which means that eventually these rises in the cost of production will be passed on to the consumers in the form of higher prices. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found this video useful.